You probably think of ancient Egypt as pyramids, golden gods with falcon heads. But let me tell you, behind all that mystique was something a lot stranger. Marriage. Forget candlelit ceremonies or white dresses. In Egypt, marriage wasn't about love, romance or fairy tales. It was about property, survival, fertility, and sometimes, yes, marrying your own sister, or your daughter, or both. And this isn't rumour. This is written in papyri, carved into stone, whispered across 3,000 years of desert wind. The rules of Egyptian marriage were as bizarre as they were practical. Legal contracts that looked more like business deals, gods demanding incest to preserve sacred bloodlines, and women who could, on paper, divorce their husbands, but in reality were trapped in households where they were little more than bargaining chips. Before we dive in, do me a favour. If you enjoy peeling back history's strangest corners, hit that like button and subscribe. And in the comments, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Always blows my mind when someone from Tokyo is listening at dawn, while someone else in Chicago is passing out to the same story. Now, dim the lights, pull the blanket up, because what you're about to hear isn't the Egypt of Hollywood. It's not Cleopatra's perfect eyeliner or grand royal weddings. It's the truth, the one polite society has always been too squeamish to tell. Imagine this. You're a young girl in Thebes, maybe 12 or 13. You're barely out of childhood when your father hands you over to a man twice your age, sometimes 3 times. There's no priest, no altar, no vows, just a contract scratched onto papyrus, sealed with witnesses. And the contract doesn't say to love and cherish. It says how much food you'll get, whether you'll inherit anything, and yes, what happens if he decides he's tired of you. Now zoom out of the dusty village into the palace. The pharaoh sits on his golden throne, and next to him, his sister, sometimes his daughter, because to the Egyptians, royal blood was divine blood, too sacred to mix with ordinary people. So to keep it pure, kings married their own flesh and blood. To us it's shocking. To them it was sacred. But here's the kicker. While incestuous royal unions scandalise us today, the average Egyptian marriage was in some ways even stranger. No ceremony, no rings, no priest. You just moved in together and started sharing bread. That was marriage. Official when the neighbours noticed. Imagine explaining that to your mum. Yeah, I guess we're married now. He left his sandals by my door. And yet, despite the casual start, once you were in, you were trapped. Divorce existed, sure. Women could technically file to leave their husbands. Some papyri even survive where women walk away with part of the property. But reality wasn't kind. For poor women, leaving meant poverty, shame, sometimes even death if their families refused to take them back. Marriage in ancient Egypt was never about 2 hearts. It was about survival, about making heirs, about property, about power, and about rules so bizarre, so taboo, that even modern history books tend to skip over them. So congratulations, you've just woken up in ancient Egypt. The Nile floods in the distance, carrying life and mud. The air smells of smoke, sweat, and incense. A man haggles in the street over the price of onions. And in a cramped home just off the marketplace, a girl is being told she's a wife now, though she's barely old enough to bleed. Welcome to marriage, Egyptian style. If you were expecting romance in ancient Egypt, marriage contracts would kill that illusion faster than a desert storm. Forget roses and sweet nothings. Egyptian marriage was ink, papyrus, and signatures. And these weren't just symbolic documents. They spelled out in excruciating detail the business arrangement that was your entire future, a typical contract. It didn't say, "I will love you forever." It said, "I will provide you with so many sacks of grain a year, a measure of beer per month, and if I kick you out, you get this much silver." That was it. Your worth wasn't measured in affection or companionship. It was measured in onions, beer, and the possibility of getting dumped. One surviving contract from around 600 BC literally lists the payment a husband promised his wife if he decided to divorce her. About 12 pieces of silver and 36 sacks of grain. Not exactly a glowing love letter. It was the ancient equivalent of, if this doesn't work out, here's your severance package. And you know what's even stranger? These contracts often worked in the wife's favour, at least on paper. Women in ancient Egypt technically had more legal rights than most women in the ancient world. They could own property, inherit from their fathers, even take cases to court. A marriage contract could state exactly what she got to keep if the marriage collapsed. But like so many things, the reality didn't match the ink. Sure, a papyrus could promise her silver, but what happened if the husband refused to pay? She had to sue him in court, a grueling process where men dominated the system. Many women simply lost everything anyway. The contracts also detailed sexual obligations, though usually implied rather than blunt. A husband could take other women, even concubines, without needing to mention it. But if the wife cheated, that could mean banishment, disgrace, or worse. Double standards, baked right into the papyrus. And then there's the dirtier side of the story. Some contracts hinted at arrangements that were less about romance and more about survival for poorer women. A man might agree to house and feed a woman in exchange for her labour, both in the household and in bed. Scholars debate whether this was marriage or closer to legalised concubinage, but the lines blurred. In a society where starvation was one bad harvest away, women often signed away freedom just to have bread on the table. And if you're picturing a wedding ceremony with music, incense and blessing, forget it. There was no priest to witness a union, no vows in front of the gods. All that mattered was the contract. Neighbours saw you move in together, and the paperwork did the rest. The Egyptians treated marriage less like a divine mystery and more like a real estate deal. Imagine this scene. You're standing in a dimly lit room. Your father sits across from a middle-aged man with a scroll. The scribe scratches down words with a reed pen dipped in ink. He reads it aloud. If this man divorces her, he shall pay her 12 pieces of silver and 1 sack of barley every year. That's your wedding ceremony. No kiss, no feast, no flowers. Just two men agreeing how much you're worth if it falls apart. And then, of course, there was the unspoken rule. If you didn't produce children, preferably sons, the contract meant very little. A husband could cast you aside, bring in another wife, or keep you while bringing in a younger girl to do the job your body had failed at. Marriage wasn't sacred, it was pragmatic. If love happened, great. If not, well, at least you had onions in the contract. So when you peel away the mystique of ancient Egypt, the golden tombs, the elaborate temples, the art of gods and goddesses, marriage looks a lot less like a divine destiny and a lot more like a grubby transaction. If you think marriage in ancient Egypt was already strange, just wait until we climb the palace steps. Because for the pharaohs, marriage wasn't just about contracts, silver, or sacks of grain. It was about blood, keeping it pure, keeping it divine, and keeping it locked firmly inside the family. And yes, that means exactly what you're thinking. Incest wasn't taboo, it was policy. Pharaohs were considered living gods, children of the sun, god Ra himself, And gods, of course, were not supposed to mix their blood with common mortals. So what did they do? They married their sisters, sometimes their daughters, sometimes both. Take Ptolemy II, for instance. He married his full sister, Arsinoe II, setting the stage for centuries of royal brother-sister pairings. Cleopatra, yes, that Cleopatra, was the product of generations of inbreeding, with her dynasty stacking sibling marriages like building blocks. It wasn't just accepted, it was advertised. They carved it in hieroglyphics. The pharaoh and his great wife, who also happened to be his sister. But this wasn't confined to the ruling elite. Archaeological evidence suggests incestuous marriages existed among the common people too, especially in Roman-controlled Egypt centuries later. Census records from towns like Oxyrhynchus show that brothers and sisters sometimes married, raising questions historians still argue over. Was it cultural influence from the pharaohs? Was it practicality, keeping land and property in the family? Or was it just desperation in tight-knit villages where marriage choices were limited? Whatever the reason, incest was not whispered about in shame the way it is today. It was open, sometimes celebrated, and even recorded with pride. And the fallout? Physically, it must have been devastating. Generations of inbreeding could cause genetic weaknesses, illnesses, and early deaths. Scholars speculate that some of the grotesque deformities found in mummies, twisted spines, elongated skulls, skeletal disorders, might not just be random. They might be the physical receipts of Egypt's obsession with keeping it all in the family. Now let's get dirtier. These incestuous marriages weren't just symbolic or ceremonial, they were consummated. Ancient Egyptian texts and art don't shy away from showing the sexual realities of royal unions. Imagine the pressure of being a young girl, married off to her brother, not for love, not for companionship, but because priests and scribes told her it pleased the gods. It's a nightmare, wrapped in gold leaf. And what about the politics? These incestuous unions were often less about passion and more about power. A pharaoh's sister wife wasn't just his bedmate, she was his co-ruler. Arsinoe II, for example, was worshipped alongside Ptolemy II as a goddess in her own right. Marriage blurred into religion, and religion blurred into politics, until the whole thing became one incestuous knot of sex, power, and divine propaganda. But here's the kicker. While pharaohs were marrying their sisters to keep the bloodline divine, ordinary Egyptians were still practicing arranged marriages based on contracts, property, and survival. The gap between royal propaganda and street reality was enormous. While a pharaoh proclaimed his godlike incest to the world, a poor farmer might be marrying his cousin simply because she was the only option. Both situations revolved around the same principle. Marriage wasn't about love, it was about control. Now imagine waking up in the gilded palace as a princess destined to marry your brother. The walls are painted with gold, the floors inlaid with alabaster, incense thick in the air. You're dressed in linen finer than anything most people would ever touch. But under the jewellery and the perfumes, you know your future, a life locked to a sibling, your body used as a tool for divine legitimacy. People outside worship you as a goddess. Inside, you're a pawn trapped in a family web you can never escape. It's the darker side of Egypt's greatness, the side that rarely makes it onto museum plaques. For every majestic pyramid and golden mask, there was a family tree twisting back on itself in ways that make modern audiences squirm. So yes, incest wasn't a dirty secret in ancient Egypt. It was the foundation of dynasties. If the incestuous marriages of the pharaohs already turned your stomach, brace yourself. Because when it came to the age of marriage in ancient Egypt, the line between childhood and adulthood was almost non-existent. Girls were often married off as soon as they hit puberty, sometimes as young as 12, maybe even earlier in some cases. In fact, Egyptian marriage contracts survive to this day, showing brides listed at ages that would horrify us now, but were seen as perfectly ordinary back then. Here's the brutal truth. Ancient Egypt wasn't interested in what we'd call childhood. Life expectancy was low, disease was rampant, and survival depended on starting families quickly. If you were a girl, your body wasn't yours. It was a tool for alliances, for heirs, for keeping land within the family. Your first period wasn't just biology, it was the starting gun for marriage. And here's the kicker. Egyptian law didn't even define a strict minimum ages for marriage. Instead, puberty, or more bluntly, fertility, was the marker. The moment a girl could carry children, she was considered ready. Whether she wanted to or not didn't matter. Marriage contracts from the period give us haunting details. They record not just the names of the bride and groom, but the dowries, the property, and the legal terms. And some of those brides were barely teenagers. Meanwhile, their husbands were often much older, sometimes men in their 20s, 30s, or beyond. Imagine a 13-year-old girl married to a man who could have been her father's age. It wasn't shocking to them. It was practical. And the practice wasn't confined to the poor. Even in the glittering royal courts, young princesses were married off almost as soon as they could bleed. Amenhotep III, one of Egypt's great pharaohs, married a girl named Tiye when she was around 12 years old. And he wasn't an exception. Royal girls were especially valuable for forging alliances, and the earlier they were available, the more marriages could be negotiated to strengthen the dynasty. This is where the ugliness gets real. Because while ancient Egyptian poetry sometimes paints marriage as romantic, sweet lines about love and longing carved onto papyrus, the reality for many of these young girls was fear and coercion. They were moved from their family homes into the households of their new husbands, often men much older, surrounded by unfamiliar servants and in-laws. There's also evidence that virginity was prized in marriage contracts, with some clauses making it clear that a bride was expected to be untouched until her wedding night, which means young girls were under pressure not only to marry early, but to maintain a level of purity that made them valuable. If not, the shame wasn't theirs alone. It could disgrace their entire family. And while boys often had a little more time before they were expected to marry, they weren't entirely spared. Some boys might be married in their early teens too, but generally later than girls. Girls carried the brunt of this early marriage system because reproduction was everything. Now picture this in daily life. You're 12 years old, still playing with dolls carved from wood, and suddenly you're dressed in linen, painted with coal, and led into a marriage ceremony. Priests chant, contracts are signed, and in the eyes of your society, you're no longer a child. You're a wife. You're expected to bear children, to run a household, to be loyal to a man who likely has other wives or concubines already. And the system didn't let you escape. Divorce was technically possible in ancient Egypt. Contracts even included divorce terms. But for a young bride without money, family backing or status, leaving a marriage was almost unthinkable. You were bound, body and future, to the man chosen for you. This is the side of ancient Egypt museums rarely talk about. Behind the gold masks and temple walls, countless girls were shoved into adulthood before they even understood what it meant. Their childhoods ended at puberty, their fates sealed by ink on papyrus, and the expectations of a society that saw them as resources, not individuals. The irony? In Egyptian love poetry, wives were sometimes called mistresses of the house, or even beloved companions. But for the countless child brides, love had little to do with it. Marriage was survival. Marriage was business. Marriage was sacrifice. So while modern visitors walk through Cairo's museums, marvelling at the beauty of Thiers statues or Cleopatra's jewels, the truth lingers between the cracks of those marriage contracts. Many of Egypt's wives were still children. If you thought marriage in ancient Egypt was tough enough with its child brides and family politics, wait until you see what came next: polygamy and concubinage. Because in practice, for many men, especially the powerful ones, one wife was never enough. Let's clear something up first. Technically, official polygamy wasn't the norm for average Egyptians. The majority of men married one woman, often out of economic necessity. Life was expensive. Feeding multiple wives and children simply wasn't realistic for most. But for the elite, the pharaohs, nobles, wealthy merchants, the rules bent fast. They kept not just wives, but entire harems of concubines. And the word harem isn't just some exotic fantasy cooked up by Hollywood. Archaeological finds and ancient writings confirm that wealthy men, and especially kings, had secondary wives, mistresses, and women kept for sexual pleasure. Some were foreigners captured during wars and given as gifts. Others were slaves purchased in markets. Still others were local women, often from lower classes, whose families had little say in what happened once their daughter was chosen. Now imagine this from the perspective of the main wife. On papyrus, she was honoured with titles like Lady of the House or Mistress of all Wives. But behind closed doors, she was sharing her husband with a carousel of younger women. Some barely teenagers, some captives who spoke different languages, some who were clearly brought in only for beauty or fertility. Jealousy, rivalries, and schemes brewed constantly in these households. Historians even suggest that in some royal courts, poisonings and accusations of sorcery weren't uncommon, as wives tried to edge out their competition. The pharaohs, of course, took this to obscene levels. Ramses II, the so-called Great, is believed to have had over 200 wives and concubines, plus countless children. He didn't even bother hiding it. Inscriptions proudly recorded the number of his offspring as though it was a measure of his greatness. Imagine living in a palace where dozens of women were all technically your stepmothers, and half the city might be your half-sibling. The family tree wasn't just complicated, it was a tangle of lust and politics. But even outside the palaces, concubines weren't rare. Wealthy men might keep secondary wives or household concubines. They didn't have the legal standing of the main wife, but they were expected to bear children, cook, clean, and of course, provide sexual services. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Consent wasn't part of the equation. If you were a slave concubine, your body belonged to your master. Period. Refusal wasn't an option. Even religion didn't stop this system. Temples sometimes housed women who were technically wives of the god or sacred musicians, but there's evidence that many were effectively kept as concubines for priests and pharaohs. These so-called holy women were paraded with honour, yet behind the incense and ritual, their lives were far from sacred. Now, for the men, all of this came with its own risks. Polygamy and concubinage fueled endless family drama. Sons born from concubines sometimes challenged the legitimacy of the sons born from the official wife. Wars of succession tore through dynasties because of this. For every proud pharaoh carving his name into temples, there were dozens of women scheming in his household, whispering in ears, trying to push their child toward the throne. And here's the really twisted irony. While men could collect wives and concubines like trophies, women had almost no right to do the same. A wife caught cheating could be publicly humiliated, divorced, or even punished far more severely than her husband ever would be for bedding half the palace. So what did this look like in practice? Imagine being a concubine in a noble's house. You sleep in a small crowded chamber with the other women waiting to be summoned. You're dressed in linen, perfumed with oils, your body maintained not because you want to, but because your master demands it. You watch as the main wife eats better food, sits in the best chair, and reminds you constantly of your inferior status. Every day, you know you could be discarded, traded, or replaced by someone younger. The system was a trap, gilded for some, brutal for most, and it reveals a dark side of ancient Egyptian marriage that rarely makes it into museum exhibits. Marriage was less about love and more about power, property, and control of the female body. So while romantic poems survive on papyrus, with lovers writing lines like, "I wish I were your mirror so I could gaze at you always," the reality was messier, crueler, and often humiliating for the women involved. Behind the poetry was a world where a man's lust and status determined how many women he owned, and a woman's worth was reduced to her womb and her obedience. When you hear incestuous marriage, your mind probably jumps to pharaohs, Cleopatra marrying her brother, Ptolemaic rulers stacking generation after generation of sibling unions to keep royal blood pure. And yes, those are the famous examples, but here's the dirty little truth. Incest wasn't just a royal quirk, it seeps down into Egyptian society, and the records prove it. Historians were shocked when census documents from Roman-controlled Egypt around the 1st–3rd centuries AD revealed something scandalous. Ordinary Egyptian families, farmers, craftsmen, everyday villagers were marrying their siblings. Not cousins, not distant relatives, but full brothers and sisters. And it wasn't rare. In some areas, up to 20 and 25% of recorded marriages were between siblings. Why? That's the million-dollar question. For some, it was economic. Keep land and property inside the family. If your daughter married a stranger, half the inheritance could walk out the door. Marry her to her brother? Problem solved. Others may have been imitating pharaohs, believing sibling unions carried divine favour. After all, the gods themselves were written into incestuous relationships. Isis and Osiris, Geb and Nut, even Shu and Tefnut. The heavens themselves seem to sanction what we now see as taboo. Now imagine the reality of it. A girl grows up in a mud brick household, playing with her brother in the courtyard. Then at puberty, she's told by her parents that this same boy will be her husband. No choice, no courtship, no escape. She shares a bed with the same person who once shared her toys. It's not some exotic royal ritual anymore. It's the average family's dirty little contract. And here's the thing no textbook tells you. This wasn't universally accepted. Some Egyptians wrote letters condemning these unions as repulsive. Outsiders, especially Greeks and Romans, found it appalling, even though they had their own twisted marriage practices. But in rural Egypt, it carried on for centuries, hidden behind the facade of normalcy. The worst part? The children. Inbreeding, as we know today, brings serious health risks, genetic defects, deformities, weakened immune systems. Evidence from mummies shows children of incestuous unions often had physical abnormalities. Some were stillborn, some lived short, painful lives, but the cycle continued. Families too focused on property to care about the biological toll. And while pharaohs are remembered in stone carvings with divine halos, the reality was often grotesque. Tutankhamun, the boy king, was himself the product of incest. CT scans and DNA tests on his mummy revealed a club foot, cleft palate, and fragile bones. He probably walked with a cane and suffered constant pain, all because his parents were siblings. Yet this wasn't seen as tragedy at the time. It was loyalty to tradition. What's even more unsettling is how normalised it became in certain villages. Papyrus contracts explicitly spell out sibling marriages with the same legal formulas as any other. Dowries, inheritance rights, obligations. The only difference was the names on the parchment were brother and sister. Neighbours might have whispered, but no one dragged them to court. Now, to put yourself in that world, picture being a 14-year-old Egyptian girl. You've just started your period. You're pulled aside by your mother, who tells you you'll soon be married. Your heart races, maybe to the boy down the street, the one with strong arms from grinding grain. But no, it's to your own brother, the one you've shared meals and secrets with since childhood. There's no ceremony of romance, no flutter of butterflies, just a contract, a bed, and the knowledge that everyone expects you to bear children who will also carry the weight of this family arrangement. It's one of the dirtiest truths about ancient Egyptian marriage. That incest wasn't just a royal eccentricity. It was a widespread, systemic practice, shaping the lives of countless ordinary women who never had a choice. And while temples sang of divine unions between gods, flesh and blood sisters were being handed to their brothers in the name of family honour and greed. When most people picture ancient Egypt, they imagine loyal wives kneeling beside their husbands' sarcophagi, eternal devotion carved in hieroglyphs. But here's the scandalous reality. Ancient Egypt was one of the few ancient societies where women could actually divorce their husbands. And some did it with flair, spite, and lawsuits that read like soap operas. Egyptian marriages weren't for life, they were contracts, drawn upon papyrus, with clauses, dowries, and escape hatches. If a man cheated, neglected his wife, or simply failed to provide, she could take him to court. And the court, surprisingly, often sided with women. In fact, some wives walked away not just free, but richer than they'd been before. Now here's the dirty detail. Many divorces weren't just about abuse or abandonment. They were about betrayals so public that they humiliated families. Imagine this. You're a wife in Thebes and you find out your husband has been spending nights in a brothel instead of at home. Worse, he's wasting your dowry money on prostitutes. You take him before the local scribes, accuse him of shaming the household, and demand your dowry back. And the records show sometimes the judges handed it to the wife, while the man slinked away in disgrace. Some cases were nastier. One papyrus describes a husband who tried to cheat his wife out of her property by claiming she was lazy and unfit. She fought back, dragged him to court, and the officials tore into his lies. She walked out with her land intact, and him branded as a fraud. In a society where reputation meant everything, that was a public castration of sorts. And let's not sugarcoat the vengeance. Women didn't always wait for the courts. There are hints in letters and contracts that wives, upon being betrayed, would curse their husbands, appeal to local priests to ruin his luck, or worse, spread rumours that he was impotent. In a world obsessed with fertility, nothing could destroy a man faster than whispers that his seed was weak. Now imagine yourself in that world. You're a wife, married off at 15, carrying the weight of managing a household. One day, You hear your husband laughing with another woman in the marketplace, his hand lingering on her arm. The fury boils. You know you can't strike him publicly. He's still the man of the house, but you can hit him where it hurts. That night, you whisper to your neighbours that his manhood isn't what it used to be. Within weeks, he's the laughingstock of your village, while you prepare your legal petition for divorce. Divorce also exposed something raw. That marriage, at its core, was business. A wife could leave if she wasn't satisfied, but she almost always fought for her property rights. Contracts often gave women the ability to take back their dowries, demand a portion of wealth, or even claim custody of children. It wasn't romantic revenge. It was cold, calculated survival. But here's the scandal most people don't know. Some women turned divorce into opportunity. Freed from one husband, they remarried quickly, sometimes moving up the social ladder. A baker's daughter could become a merchant's wife. A merchant's widow could snag a minor noble. Each failed marriage wasn't just heartbreak. It was a stepping stone. Of course, men weren't saints either. Some tried to frame their wives as sorceresses to void a marriage, accusing them of casting spells or poisoning food. Others claimed their wives had wandered with strangers. But the papyri show many women successfully defended themselves, turning accusations back on their husbands. One particularly juicy case describes a wife who, accused of witchcraft, revealed that her husband was secretly sleeping with his slave girl. The court sided with her. The scandal destroyed him. So much for loyal, submissive wives. In reality, Egyptian women had claws, legal claws. They fought, they sued, they shamed, and sometimes they won. Behind the hieroglyphs of harmony lay stories of marital collapse that were as dirty, bitter, and human as any messy divorce today. Here's where ancient Egyptian marriage shows its dirtiest underbelly. Cheating wasn't equal. A husband could visit prostitutes, keep mistresses, or even sleep with slaves, and society barely raised an eyebrow. But if a wife so much as smiled too long at another man, she risked her reputation, her dowry, even her life. Infidelity in ancient Egypt was not a private shame. It was a public scandal. Women caught in adultery could be dragged into the street, paraded before neighbours, or thrown out of the home with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Some contracts even had clauses that said, if the wife strays, she forfeits her property. Imagine signing a marriage paper that basically warned, step out of line once, and you're ruined. Meanwhile, men strutted around with near impunity. Records show that wealthy men frequently kept concubines in addition to their wives. These women were sometimes slaves, sometimes poor villagers, and sometimes simply hired companions. A wife might know her husband was sneaking into a brothel down by the river, or bedding a maidservant in the kitchen. But the law was clear. His body belonged to him. Hers belonged to him too. Her body, on the other hand, belonged only to him. This double standard wasn't just tolerated, it was institutionalized. In the villages along the Nile, prostitution was often taxed, meaning the state profited from men's infidelity. Archaeologists have found papyri detailing brothel payments, suggesting that the practice was regulated. So, while wives could lose everything for a single affair, husbands literally paid taxes on their extramarital sex, and no one blinked. But here's where it gets ugly. Women didn't always stay silent. Some fought back in subtle, dangerous ways. In court records, there are cases where wives accused their husbands of neglect, citing his visits to other women. Sometimes they shamed him publicly, spreading word in the marketplace that his manhood wasn't satisfying enough, or worse, that he brought diseases home. Imagine being the husband mocked as weak in bed by your own wife in front of your neighbours. That's a reputation you never recover from. Now let's step into that world. You're a wife, married young, barely out of your teens. Your husband spends his evenings away. The smell of perfume and beer clinging to his clothes when he returns. He ignores your children, forgets your meals, but expects you to smile. You know you can't confront him outright, not without risking your place in the house. So you quietly curse him under your breath, visit a local priest to bless your amulet, and spread whispers among the women at the well. By the time he walks through the market, people laugh behind his back. He knows it's you, and the war between husband and wife has gone public. Infidelity wasn't just personal, it destabilised households. A cheating husband might father illegitimate children with a servant or prostitute. Those children could grow up demanding inheritance, challenging the legitimate heirs. Entire families were torn apart, not just by affairs, but by the fallout. Bitter lawsuits, disinherited children, and wives dragged into court to defend their status as the real family. And then there was the darker side, violence. Some Papyrian letters hint that husbands beat wives accused of adultery, sometimes fatally. While Egypt granted women more rights than Greece or Rome, it was still a man's world. A woman who strayed risked not just divorce, but a brutal end. Men, however, shielded by law and custom, rarely faced more than a bruise to their pride. But scandals didn't stay hidden. In temple towns, priests sometimes recorded public moral outrages. One document mentions a man condemned for corrupting married women, a rare case where male infidelity was punished. But it wasn't because he cheated. It was because he dared seduce the wives of other men, disrupting the social order. Sleeping with prostitutes? Fine. Sleeping with someone else's wife? Dangerous. The hypocrisy was baked into the system. Men could indulge, women could suffer. Yet the stories that survive remind us that women weren't voiceless victims. They whispered, they shamed, they cursed, and sometimes they clawed their way to revenge. Incest. It's the ugliest word you can attach to marriage. But in ancient Egypt's royal courts, it wasn't whispered in shame. It was shouted in hymns, carved in stone, and paraded in ceremonies. To the pharaoh, a god on earth, marrying his sister or even his daughter wasn't just allowed, it was expected. For centuries, royal Egypt thrived on a system where family beds doubled as dynastic thrones, and keeping the divine blood pure meant doing things that would horrify anyone today. Let's set the stage. Imagine the palace of Alexandria under the Ptolemies. Marble halls echoing with footsteps, courtiers draped in silks, and in the centre of it all, a royal couple smiling for the people. But look closer. The queen is 14 years old. Her husband is her brother. And their father, the pharaoh, is watching with approval, because that's exactly how it's supposed to be. The Egyptians justified this with religion. Their mythology itself was incestuous. Osiris married his sister, Isis. Their son, Horus, was worshipped as the rightful heir. To the priests, Pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was Osiris reborn, which meant that for order to continue, he had to mimic the gods, marrying his sister to recreate divine unity. What looks like perversion to us was, to them, divine theatre. But there's a difference between myth and reality. In reality, these weren't divine gods. They were flesh and blood siblings, forced into sexual unions for the sake of politics. Cleopatra's dynasty alone offers grotesque proof. Out of 16 dynastic marriages in the Ptolemaic line, at least 10 were between the brothers and sisters, Cleopatra herself married two of her brothers, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIII, both barely teenagers at the time. To the public, it was royal tradition. To Cleopatra, likely disgust wrapped in duty. Now here's the dirty detail no schoolbook mentions. These weren't symbolic unions, they were physical. Brother and sister were expected to sleep together, to produce heirs, to bind the throne through their own bloodlines. Ancient papyri and Roman accounts drop hints. Pregnancies, miscarriages, and unnatural stillbirths plagued the royal women. Tutankhamun, centuries earlier, is believed to have been the product of such a union. His mummy shows clubfoot, scoliosis, a cleft palate. The Golden Boy King was the fragile result of centuries of sibling sex. Picture this: a royal wedding feast. The palace glitters with gold. Musicians play, priests chant. The people watch in awe as their pharaoh and his sister stand side by side, decked in jewels. It looks divine. But later, when the torches dim, a 14-year-old girl is led to her brother's chambers. No choice, no escape. Behind the heavy curtains, the duty of purity is enforced in the most intimate, degrading way. That was the hidden truth of Egypt's glittering crowns, and it didn't stop with siblings. Pharaohs sometimes took daughters as brides. Ptolemy VIII, the most infamous of the Ptolemies, first married his sister, Cleopatra II. Then he seduced her daughter, his own niece and stepdaughter, and married her too. He fathered children with both mother and daughter, setting off one of the most sordid soap operas in ancient history. Cleopatra's attempt eventually revolted, leading to a bloody civil war within the family. But by then the dynasty was already rotting from the inside. The inbreeding took its toll. Deformed heirs, weak rulers, madness. Royal physicians wrote of strange swellings and decay of the flesh, symptoms modern scientists now link to genetic disease. In the end, what had begun as a way to preserve sacred blood ended up poisoning it. The same incest that was supposed to guarantee divine power brought fragility and collapse. But perhaps the most disturbing part? The hypocrisy. Ordinary Egyptians were forbidden from marrying siblings. A farmer in the Nile Delta who lay with his sister could face exile or worse. Yet in the palaces, incest was celebrated. Coins showed brother and sister as king and queen. Temples were decorated with statues of siblings in embrace. To the poor, incest was a crime. To the rich, it was propaganda. Roman writers loved mocking this. They called the Ptolemies degenerate, sneering at their marriages. But behind the satire, there was horror. Even in decadent Rome, where orgies and brothels thrived, sibling marriage was considered too far. That's how extreme Egypt's royals had become. So when we talk about the strange rules of Egyptian marriage, this is the darkest one. The pharaoh's bed was not a place of love or romance. It was a political weapon, a place where sisters were stripped of childhood, where daughters were handed over to fathers, where purity became a prison. It's the dirtiest open secret of ancient history. The throne of Egypt was built on incest, and yet, to Egyptians, it wasn't shame. It was survival. When we think of ancient Egyptian marriages, we picture romance carved in hieroglyphs, a couple holding hands, lotus flowers, the Nile at sunset. The truth? Egyptian marriages were about paperwork, cold, brutally detailed contracts that read less like a promise of love and more like a business deal mixed with a threat. Archaeologists have uncovered dozens of these marriage contracts, written on papyrus in careful script. They look dry at first glance, but once you dig in, they reveal the strangest, pettiest and dirtiest realities of married life. Forget till death do us part. Ancient Egyptian contracts said things like how many loaves of bread and jars of beer the husband had to provide weekly, the exact compensation owed if he cheated, the punishment if he decided to throw his wife out. Yes, imagine this. Your husband cheats, and instead of heartbreak, you slam the papyrus on the table and say, "That'll be 5 demon of silver, thank you very much." It was divorce court before divorce courts existed. But let's add the dirt. Some contracts spelled out bedroom duties, in code of course, but clear enough. A man could demand her presence on certain nights, while she could legally complain if he neglected her. Sex wasn't a private act of passion, it was a clause in the deal. One contract from the Ptolemaic period bluntly stated that if a husband took another wife, he had to keep satisfying the first one as before. Imagine needing a legal reminder to not ignore your spouse's bed. And then came the financial humiliation. If a man tossed his wife aside, he didn't just lose her, he lost money. Contracts often forced him to hand over silver, livestock, or even slaves. One particularly vicious contract declared that if a man divorced his wife without cause, he owed her 1/3 of his property. Suddenly the sacred Nile marriage starts looking like an episode of Judge Judy. Of course, women weren't innocent angels in these documents either. Some contracts included clauses where wives swore not to raise her voice or speak evil of her husband. Others demanded she not go out at night without permission. A nice way of saying, you'd better not sneak to the neighbour's bed. Egyptian men were terrified of being mocked in public, and gossip was treated like betrayal. And here's where it gets dirtier. Some contracts treated wives almost like prostitutes on retainer. There are papyri where men agreed to pay a daily living allowance in exchange for the wife's continued companionship. The line between marriage and transaction blurred so hard that historians still argue, were these contracts about love or about hiring a permanent partner who doubled as housekeeper, sex worker, and air maker? Imagine yourself here for a moment. You're in a cramped mud brick house on the edge of Memphis. The contract sits rolled on a shelf next to jars of grain. You and your husband fight. He threatens to leave, but he doesn't, because that papyrus means he'll be ruined if he walks away. So instead, you both sit there in a smoky room, chewing stale bread, tied together not by love, but by ink, threats, and money. That's the real glue of Egyptian marriage. And let's not forget the pettiness. Some contracts detail dowries so obsessively you can almost hear the in-laws arguing. One wife's dowry listed a bronze mirror, 2 beds, 3 linen tunics, and 1 donkey. If the marriage failed, she got them all back. Imagine carting a donkey home after a messy breakup. Religion loomed here too. Contracts often included oaths to the gods, with curses attached. If I fail in these duties, may Anubis destroy my seed, may Ra blind my eyes. The stakes weren't just legal, they were cosmic. Divorce wasn't just shameful, it risked eternal damnation. The strangest part, these contracts gave women surprising power compared to other ancient societies. Unlike Greek wives locked in houses, Egyptian women could sue, divorce, and walk away with wealth. But that power came at a cost. Every detail of their lives was commodified. Love, sex, loyalty, all boiled down to papyrus ink and signatures. So while Egyptian poets sang about eternal devotion and artists painted graceful couples on tomb walls, the truth was dirtier. Marriages were contracts, beds were bargaining chips, and even the most sacred relationships were ruled by clauses and loopholes. The Nile didn't flow on romance, it flowed on paperwork. When we imagine ancient Egyptian marriage, We often picture one husband, one wife, maybe a few children running around a mud brick courtyard. But in reality, for men of wealth and power, the idea of just one wife was laughable. Polygamy wasn't outlawed, and concubines were as common in elite households as jars of beer. And if you're thinking, well, that must have been paradise for men, you're wrong. It was chaos, a never-ending soap opera of jealousy, scheming, and humiliation. Let's start with the kings. Pharaohs had official wives, but they also filled their palaces with secondary wives and concubines, often dozens or even hundreds. These weren't just lovers, they were political hostages. Many were foreign princesses, sent as gifts in alliances. Imagine being a teenage girl, shipped across deserts, dumped into a palace where you don't even speak the language, and told your only job is to please the king and hopefully bear him sons. It was less romance, more state-sanctioned trafficking. But this wasn't just a royal thing. Wealthy men often kept concubines too, usually enslaved women or poorer locals. These women were technically not wives, but they lived in the house, did the chores, and were expected to warm the bed when called. The main wife might hate them, but the law recognised them. In fact, contracts sometimes mentioned concubines by name, with chilling instructions like, if I take another woman, I will continue to provide to my first wife the same as before. Which sounds noble until you realise it means, yes, honey, I'll still sleep with you, while I also sleep with her. This led to constant tension. Archaeological letters show wives complaining about concubines being favoured. Imagine the humiliation of seeing your husband flaunt another woman in your own courtyard while you're grinding grain nearby. Some wives fought back in quiet ways, withholding affection, cursing rivals, or in extreme cases, poisoning. Yes, there are whispers in medical papyri about potions women brewed. Not for healing, but for revenge. Here's the dirty part nobody talks about. Concubines often carried disease. In a world with no soap and no real medicine, one man sleeping with multiple women meant infections spread fast. We know from medical papyri that Egyptian doctors treated endless cases of genital sores, discharges, and burning pains. These weren't abstract problems. They were the direct result of polygamous households, where fidelity was optional and hygiene non-existent. And the children? Oh, the chaos doubled. With multiple wives and concubines came armies of half-siblings, all fighting for inheritance. Sons of concubines often had fewer rights, but some clawed their way into power anyway. Court records show bloody succession battles where princes assassinated each other just to secure the throne. The family drama of Egyptian kings wasn't just shouting, it was murder, staged as inheritance disputes. But don't think ordinary families were safe from this chaos. A middle-class man with 2 wives might see his home turn into a battlefield of gossip and sabotage. One wife might curse the other's food, whisper rumours in the neighbourhood, or spread lies about her children. Remember, in a world without privacy, this drama unfolded in mud brick courtyards, with neighbours listening in. Everyone knew your dirty secrets, and everyone gossiped. For women, sharing a husband was degrading, but often unavoidable. Dowries and contracts could protect them financially, but emotionally, it was torture. Imagine lying on your straw bed at night, hearing your husband in the next room with another woman. There's no divorce if you can't pay the costs. There's no escape if your family won't take you back. You're trapped in a daily performance of humiliation. Even worse, sometimes wives themselves encourage their husbands to take concubines. Why? Childlessness. If a wife couldn't bear children, especially sons, she was often pressured to bring in another woman as a solution. It was like inviting your own replacement into the bed. Imagine the bitterness of watching another woman raise the heir that should have been yours, and yet religion legitimized it all. Gods like Amun and Osiris were praised for their fertility, and pharaohs boasting dozens of wives were seen as imitating divine potency. Instead of shame, polygamy was framed as power. The more wives you had, the closer you were to godhood. Meanwhile, the women endured the daily stink of jealousy, betrayal, and disease. So while the wall paintings showed serene queens sitting beside their powerful husbands, the reality behind those scenes was dirtier. A household divided, women plotting against each other, concubines treated like objects, and children raised in an environment where love was secondary to survival. Ancient Egyptian marriage wasn't built on trust. It was built on a balancing act between wives, concubines, contracts, and the fragile ego of the man at the centre. And when that balance collapsed, as it often did, the results were violent, humiliating, and unforgettable. If you thought multiple wives and concubines created chaos, wait until you hear about the Egyptian obsession with keeping bloodlines pure. Because in the royal courts of ancient Egypt, some marriages crossed lines that still make historians squirm. Pharaohs and queens, kings and princesses, they often married their own sisters, half-sisters, even daughters. And no, this wasn't some wild rumour. It was official policy, carved into stone and celebrated as divine. The logic was twisted but simple. The pharaoh wasn't just a man. He was a god on earth, the living Horus. And gods in Egyptian mythology often married their sisters. Isis and Osiris, the divine couple, were siblings. So when a pharaoh took his sister as his queen, he wasn't breaking taboo. He was imitating the gods. What looked like incest to us was holiness to them. But behind the divine excuse was politics. Keeping the throne within the family prevented outsiders from seizing power. A daughter or sister wasn't just a wife. She was a shield, a way to lock power in a tight circle. And if that meant twisted family dinners where your wife was also your sister, so be it. The practice wasn't limited to pharaohs either. By the Ptolemaic period, the dynasty that ended with Cleopatra, brother-sister marriages had become practically expected. Cleopatra herself married two of her brothers, Ptolemy Thephanes and Sultan. Historians argue whether these marriages were truly consummated or just political rituals, but given the brutal competitiveness of that dynasty, many suspect the bedroom was not off limits. Here's the dirty truth. Incestuous marriages weren't just royal. Papyri from provincial towns show brother-sister marriages among common Egyptians during the Roman period too. In places like Oxyrhynchus, census records reveal families where siblings registered as married couples. Imagine the household drama. Your parents approve of your marriage to your sister. Your neighbours don't bat an eye. It's not gossip, it's normal. But here's the cost nobody talks about. Generations of inbreeding produced sickly heirs. Pharaohs often suffered from deformities, fragile health, and infertility. The mummies tell the story better than texts. Tutankhamun, for instance, was the child of a brother-sister union. CT scans of his remains show a clubfoot, cleft palate, and fragile bones. He needed a cane to walk and likely died young because his body simply couldn't handle the genetic weight of so much inbreeding. That's the hidden horror of these divine marriages. They created heirs too weak to survive, but the personal toll was just as grotesque. Imagine being a young princess. told you must marry your own father or brother. There's no consent, no escape. Your body becomes a pawn in a ritual that everyone pretends is holy. You're forced into a life where your husband is also your sibling, and society applauds it. Women weren't celebrated as partners. They were sacrificial offerings, trapped in twisted family politics, and yet the propaganda painted it as glorious. In temple carvings, sibling couples are shown smiling, hand in hand, like lovers in paradise. Priests preach that this purity preserved cosmic order. Behind the facade, quiet misery, disease, and heirs born too weak to rule. The strangest part? This wasn't secret shame. Egyptians celebrated it openly. Tomb inscriptions proudly proclaimed when kings married sisters. Statues of queens show them pressed tightly to their royal brothers, their faces serene, as if to say, "This is how it should be." But when foreign visitors came, the disgust was palpable. Greek and Roman writers couldn't stop mocking Egyptian incest. They called it barbaric, grotesque, a sign that Egypt was both decadent and doomed. Of course, these same writers had their own scandals, but to them, Egypt's family entanglements were beyond comprehension. So the next time you see Cleopatra in a movie, framed as a seductress of generals and emperors, remember, before she tangled with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, she was married to her own teenage brother. It wasn't passion, it was survival. It wasn't romance, it was the brutal, suffocating rule of tradition. And that was the paradox of Egyptian marriage. It could look glamorous in stone reliefs, but beneath the surface it reeked of sickness, coercion, and family ties so twisted that entire dynasties collapsed under their weight. When most people today picture marriage, they think of vows, romance, maybe a little ceremony under the sun. In ancient Egypt, forget all that. Marriage was paperwork, a contract, a list of obligations, penalties and guarantees so cold it could make a modern prenup look like a love letter. Egyptians didn't even have a religious wedding ceremony. There was no priest blessing your union, no sacred ritual to bind two souls. A man and woman were considered married once the paperwork was drawn and signed, and she moved into his home. That's it. The gods weren't invited, just lawyers with styluses and papyrus. What did these contracts say? Well, they weren't shy. They spelled out how much money or property the husband owed the wife if he divorced her. Some contracts were explicit. If he tossed her aside, he had to pay her so many sacks of grain, a few silver deben, or even livestock. Think of it as an insurance policy for being abandoned. For poor families, that clause might mean the difference between life and starvation. But don't get it twisted. These contracts weren't built for equality. The man was still firmly in charge. He could take more wives, sleep with concubines, or keep mistresses, and the woman had very little say in the matter. Her body was, in effect, a part of the deal. The contract made her both a wife and a commodity, something acknowledged and managed with neat legal lines. And here's where it gets dirtier. Some contracts outline sexual expectations. While not always spelled out in graphic terms, clauses made it clear that a wife's role included service to her husband, a veiled reference to intimacy. If she refused, he had grounds to replace her, sometimes without paying the divorce settlement. In other words, if you said no, you lost your protection. At the same time, the contracts also offered women one rare weapon. They could sue. There are surviving court records where wives dragged their husbands before judges for failing to provide food, clothing, or intimacy as promised in the contract. Imagine standing in a dusty Egyptian courtroom, pointing a finger at your husband and accusing him of neglecting you in bed. Not as a matter of romance, but as a breach of contract. It sounds almost empowering, but in reality, it was humiliating. Women's worth was reduced to how well their husband fulfilled his obligations, as if love and companionship could be tallied like bushels of wheat. The strangest part? These contracts could be incredibly specific. One papyrus mentions exact amounts of barley a husband must give his wife every month. Another outlined what happened if he beat her. And no, he wasn't forbidden from doing it. He just had to pay her compensation. Violence wasn't illegal, just taxable. And then there were the public readings. Imagine your private marriage terms being read aloud in front of witnesses. Neighbours nodding as they hear how much silver your husband owes you if he gets bored and replaces you. It turned marriage into a spectacle of shame, where everyone knew exactly what you were worth on paper. But the worst humiliation came for women without contracts. Poor women, slaves or concubines, had no legal protections at all. If a man abandoned them, they were tossed out with nothing. Some ended up begging, others sold themselves to survive. In the eyes of the law, they weren't wives, they were disposable. So while inscriptions and tomb art show couples reclining together as equals, smiling in painted eternity, the reality was a cold, contractual nightmare. Love didn't matter. Duty didn't matter. Only ink, papyrus, and signatures did. And yet, for Egyptians, this was normal. The legal system was seen as a safeguard, a way to keep society orderly. They didn't see the humiliation, the lack of affection, the way women's bodies and dignity were turned into negotiable clauses. To them, it was civilization. But when you peel it back, you see the truth. Marriage in ancient Egypt wasn't about love. It was about control. It was about possession. And it was about writing down in black ink just how much a woman's life was worth if her husband decided to walk away. Marriage in ancient Egypt came with rules, contracts, and property rights. But fidelity? That was a whole other story. In truth, the system was stacked against women from the start, because male infidelity wasn't really infidelity at all. It was tolerated, normalised, and even expected in certain households. Women, on the other hand, could pay the ultimate price for straying even once. Let's start with concubines. Wealthy men, nobles, and especially pharaohs often kept them in addition to their wives. These concubines weren't simply mistresses, they were part of a recognised system. Some were slaves bought or taken as spoils of war, others were gifts to seal political alliances. A man could have a wife, concubines, and casual lovers, all without scandal. For the women involved, however, it was a different story. They had little legal standing and lived in the shadow of the wife. Yet in many cases, the wife was forced to accept their presence in the household. Pharaohs were, of course, the most extreme example. Some kings kept harems filled with women from across the known world. Ethiopian beauties, Syrian captives, daughters of Greek traders. A pharaoh's virility was seen as proof of divine favour, so the more lovers he kept, the more powerful he appeared. What today would look like indulgence and abuse was, in their eyes, part of statecraft. But outside the palace, even an ordinary man had free rein. A husband sleeping with a concubine or a prostitute wasn't seen as breaking his vows. A woman doing the same thing? That was adultery, a crime punishable by humiliation, divorce, and sometimes even death. There are records of women being brutally punished for cheating. One ancient papyrus mentions a woman paraded naked through her village as a warning to others. Another story, whispered in fragments, hints at stoning or mutilation in extreme cases. Whether or not all of these punishments were carried out, the fear was enough. For a wife, stepping out of line sexually meant social annihilation. Yet here's the twist: women did have affairs, and sometimes the story survived. One tale tells of a married woman who fell in love with a neighbour and carried on a secret romance while her husband worked the fields. When she was caught, she was tossed out of her home with nothing. Her children taken, her possessions gone. Her lover barely punished. Some women tried to use cunning to protect themselves. There's evidence of contraceptives, concoctions of honey, crocodile dung, or acacia mixed into pessaries, used to prevent pregnancies from secret liaisons. It sounds grotesque, but for women, it was survival. An unplanned child from an affair could be a death sentence, proof of betrayal. And then there were ritual infidelities. Some fertility festivals included sacred prostitutes, where men could legally step outside their marriages under the guise of honouring the gods. It wasn't seen as cheating, but as participating in cosmic order. Imagine being the wife, watching your husband disappear into a temple chamber, knowing the divine excuse made your feelings irrelevant. This double standard was so deeply ingrained that it even showed up in legal texts. Some marriage contracts explicitly forbade the wife from taking another lover, but said nothing about the husband's behaviour. Silence became permission. For the average Egyptian woman, marriage meant vigilance. She lived under scrutiny, her reputation fragile, her fidelity monitored like a hawk. Her husband, meanwhile, could enjoy the company of prostitutes at taverns or keep a mistress in another part of town, and no one would bat an eye. The humiliation was constant. Imagine lying in a shared home, listening as your husband slipped away to another woman, and knowing you could do nothing, not even complain, without risking your own position. That was the reality: silence, endurance, and shame. At the very top of society, the stories get even darker. Pharaohs like Ramses II were said to have fathered more than 100 children, not just with wives, but with countless concubines. Some scholars argue that palace intrigue and even assassinations sometimes grew out of jealous rivalries among these women, each desperate to secure her son's claim to power. In that toxic world, love was irrelevant. Survival was everything. So in ancient Egypt, fidelity wasn't a mutual promise. It was a weapon, a leash placed on women, while men roamed free under the guise of tradition, religion, and law. The strangest part, most of society accepted it. To them, it wasn't hypocrisy. It was order. If there's one thing about ancient Egyptian marriage customs that still shocks people today, it's this: incest wasn't just tolerated in royal families, it was celebrated. Pharaohs and their kin didn't just marry cousins, they married sisters, daughters, and in some whispered cases, even mothers. And the strangest part, the Egyptians considered this perfectly legitimate, even sacred. Why? It all comes down to divine image. Pharaohs were believed to be living gods, direct descendants of Ra or Horus, embodiments of divine order on earth. And gods, as their myths told, married within their own family. Isis married Osiris. Shu paired with his sister, Tefnut. For mortals, that might look grotesque. For pharaohs, it was proof of their godliness. Take the Ptolemies, the Greek rulers who took over Egypt after Alexander the Great. They adopted this practice with zeal. Ptolemy the Kheti married his full sister, Arsinoe, scandalizing even the Greeks, who at least frowned on such unions. Later, Cleopatra herself was married to two of her brothers. Imagine the palace halls. Brothers as husbands, sisters as wives, dynasties looping back on themselves like a snake eating its own tail. But here's where it gets darker. These weren't romantic matches. They were strategies, power plays to keep wealth, land and authority locked inside one bloodline. By marrying siblings, the pharaohs avoided diluting their dynasty with common blood. To them, outsiders, no matter how noble, were a threat to divine legitimacy. Of course, incest had consequences. Scholars believe that generations of inbreeding may have led to physical deformities and genetic weaknesses. Some mummies show signs of congenital conditions, fused spines, and misshapen skulls. A famous example is Tutankhamun. CT scans and DNA studies suggest his parents were siblings, and his own body bore the toll: a clubfoot, fragile bones, and possibly epilepsy. Behind the golden mask of glory lay the price of these sacred unions. But here's a truth the polished museum plaques don't tell. Incest in royal Egypt wasn't always confined to sibling pairs. Some sources hint at darker possibilities. Pharaoh Akhenaten, known for his radical religious reforms, is whispered to have married one of his own daughters after the death of Nefertiti. Whether for ritual, succession, or sheer obsession, the line between family and spouse blurred disturbingly. Meanwhile, outside the royal palaces, incest wasn't exactly unheard of either. Records from common Egyptian families show that some brothers and sisters married in farming villages, especially in the later Greco-Roman period. Papyri reveal contracts where brothers married sisters, sometimes to preserve farmland or family wealth. For many villagers, this wasn't about divine status, it was about survival. Yet despite all the practical reasons, the practice carried whispers of unease. Satirical writings from neighbouring cultures mocked the Egyptians for their habits. Greek and Roman writers painted them as depraved, unable to separate bed from blood. But for Egyptians themselves, it was order, not chaos. The irony? While pharaohs slept with sisters to preserve purity, they often kept harems of concubines, foreign princesses, and lovers on the side. Purity in one bed, diversity in the next. The contradiction says everything about how marriage in ancient Egypt wasn't about love or even family bonds. It was about control, over bloodlines, over women, over the very definition of morality. Now picture this: Cleopatra, young and ambitious, seated beside her much younger brother, husband Ptolemy III. Publicly, they were a royal couple, bound in ritual and divine image. Privately, it was power, not passion. Their marriage ended in civil war, betrayal, and bloodshed. The sacred mask of incestuous marriage crumbled into raw politics. So while incestuous unions might shock us today, in ancient Egypt they weren't seen as scandalous. They were part of the natural order, a blend of myth, politics, and obsession with divine blood. But peel back the gold leaf, and you find deformities, rivalries, and generations of broken bodies sacrificed to keep a family tree looping in on itself. By now, you've seen it all: the polished facade of ancient Egyptian marriage and the strange, messy reality behind it. To us, their rules sound bizarre. Marrying siblings in the royal house, contracts that turned wives into near property, fertility rituals that blended sex with sacred duty, and punishments that tied women's value to their bodies and bloodlines. But to the Egyptians, this was order. To them, the strange was normal, the shocking was sacred. Pharaohs slept with sisters to keep their blood divine. Farmers bound wives in contracts that listed their chores alongside their rights to bread and oil. Women, despite the weight of control, sometimes wielded real power, divorcing husbands, keeping dowries, and even running businesses. But behind every golden tomb painting of a smiling couple, there was tension, politics, and sometimes deep misery. What makes ancient Egyptian marriage fascinating is that it was never really about love. It was about survival, about keeping dynasties intact, land in the family, gods appeased, and society functioning. The rules were strange, yes, but they reveal a truth that spans centuries. Marriage in any culture is rarely just personal. It's political, and maybe that's the strangest thing of all. The more we uncover about Egypt, the less it looks like some distant, alien world, and the more it looks like a distorted mirror of our own. A place where power dressed itself as purity, where ritual justified desire, and where the messiest truths were hidden under layers of myth and gold. So next time you think of ancient Egypt, don't just picture pyramids and pharaohs. Picture the wedding contracts inked on papyrus, the sisters turned into wives, the whispered rituals, the bruising politics of bed and throne. That was the reality of love and marriage along the Nile. Beautiful, brutal, and stranger than we ever imagined.